How to fill out a purchase contract in Texas. In this video, I'm going to dive into the 1 to 4 family residential contract for resale, otherwise known as the contract you use if you're going to purchase property in Texas. And before I dive right into it, I've got to put a full disclaimer out there. I am by no means advising you or anything of that nature. This is for educational entertainment purposes only. If you are looking to fill out one of these for an actual transaction, seek out help from your broker if you're a licensed agent, or buyer or seller even. Seek out help from a licensed real estate professional. Now, that being said, I'm going to pull up my screen here. We're going to dive right into it. So I have the latest version of the promulgated 1 to 4 family resale contract here, which, by the way, if you're an agent, you can see the latest forms updated on the site here. So this one's effective as of February 1st, 2023. It's the most latest one. It's important to understand if you're watching this in the future, it's possible that it's been updated since. So make sure you're using the latest form. And so I'm gonna go paragraph by paragraph through this, and I highly recommend reading all of it. I know most of us are not crazy about contract language, but it's important to understand what this says and what it means, especially if you're about to enter into a contract for the purchase or sell of a property, or especially if you're an agent helping other people navigate this process. You got to know exactly what it says and be able to help guide people accordingly. So hopefully this helps sharpen up your knowledge base, if nothing else. But parties to the transaction, that is who is the agreement between the seller and the buyer. Legal names should be on there. I mean, the seller's name should match exactly what's on the title of the property. Buyer name should be, it should match up with the lender if there's a lender involved, but full name. And if there's more than one seller buyer, you want to make sure their names are all on there. If it's an entity name, the entity will be the seller or buyer, and title's going to want to see the corresponding documents to show that, you know, the entity's in good standing and current and all that good stuff. But anyway, let's keep on moving here. Property is the property that is being sold. So you got a lot number, a block number, and a legal description. I would copy the exact legal description that is on the tax record, which you can pull those up online. Your county CAD will have it typically, so copy paste whatever's on there. It might be long, it might be short. A lot and block, it might be numbers, it might be letters, it could be a combination thereof. It's usually different for different places, but just copy exactly what's on there for the lot, the block, and then the legal description. City, what city is it being sold in? County, same thing there. What county, and you got the address and zip code. So the address, that's the street address, so the numbers, the street, and then zip code. Boom. Pretty simple and straightforward. You want to know what all this stuff means, and primarily we're talking filling in blanks here. That's a nice thing. I mean, if you're a real estate agent, you're not writing contracts or legal language. You're simply helping people fill in blanks. There's finite amount of blanks in which all the terms of the agreement are being spelled out, which actually this will help simplify things. So write this down if you're taking notes. There's only a finite amount of terms when you're talking about a negotiation of a contract. You're talking about price, dates, contingencies, inclusions and exclusions, and terms. Those are the 5 things. And so within the blanks, you have all those 5 things being covered: price, inclusions, exclusions, terms, contingencies, and dates. So those are your 5 things. And so one of the first things you're going to see here in a moment is the price. But before that, it's important to note, well, what's this mean as far as exclusions go? So the following improvements and accessories will be retained by the seller and must be removed prior to delivery or possession. So improvements and accessories are actually a part of the property. So the property is not just the lot, it's not just the house, it's all of this stuff as well. Anything that would be considered a fixture or improvement, anything that's attached to the property effectively. And this gives you a ton of examples of what some of those things will consist of. And then you got accessories as well, like keys, stuff like that, pulls. I mean, read everything it says, but it's very important to note, if the seller is wanting to retain any of these items, they've got to be spelled out here in this agreement. because otherwise they can't just take a chandelier if it wasn't agreed upon in this actual contract here. And so it's very important. I mean, same with even TV mounts. Technically, they're attached to the property. Those are not supposed to be removed unless it's spelled out in the contract. So this might seem simple, but it's important to understand how this is broken down. So you got a cash portion A, and then you got the sum of financing. So the correct way to fill this out would be, hey, whatever the total sales price is line C here. So you add line A and line B, and you got the total sales price, which is the bottom line number. And so you want to figure out what portion is cash, what is not cash. So, I mean, one example, if it's a VA 100% financing, you might have $0 cash and you're financing the whole amount. On the flip side, conventional 20% down, we'll do the math. If you got a sales price, 20% is going to be cash. The remainder 80 is going to be this, and it's going to add up to the total sales price. So make sure you're selecting the correct box. If there's third-party financing like conventional VA, FHA, etc., you use that. If there's any of these special kind of terms here, then you would use the appropriate box. If it's an all-cash sale, guess what? You're not using B at all. It's just going to be cash portion there, and then that will add up to the total. Leases. So if applicable, you're going to use the appropriate box for this. You can, have residential leases if there's one in place currently with the property. So if it has tenants in it, you want to make sure that's selected and that you attach the appropriate documentation along with that. Same thing with, fixture leases and then natural resource leases. So fixture lease, it might be like, solar panels, propane tanks. It gives you examples there. Natural resources, if that applies, and then make sure you check the appropriate boxes if that were to be the case. And then earnest money and termination option. So earnest money is effectively the deposit to secure the property, to take it off the market. And so whatever the dollar amount would be on that. And by the way, a lot of people, even agents, mess this up, because I've seen this as a listing agent reviewing offers and stuff. A lot of people put the incorrect thing on here. So escrow agent, that does not mean a person. And the escrow agent is the title company that's handling the closing. So you should never put an individual's name in here. It should always be the company that is the escrow agent. So whatever the title company is called, that's where the earnest money is being delivered. They're the ones holding it. A person's not holding it. The company's holding it in their accounts. So title company name, what address is the title company located at? What's the dollar amount of the earnest money being delivered, and what is the dollar amount of the option fee if there is an option fee. So the difference between earnest money and option fee is earnest money is like your deposit to secure the property, take it off market. The option is an option to terminate. So you'll have a set amount of days. Again, that's negotiated. We'll get to that here in a moment. But your option is basically the easiest way for a buyer to walk away from the contract. In Texas, this is what I would think of as your inspection period. So if you want a certain amount of days to get your inspections taken care of, that's what you'll want to account for in the option period. Easiest way to go about it. If there is additional earnest money, that's where this would come into play. There doesn't have to be, so it's okay to leave this blank unless that's a term that is applicable in the situation. And then termination option, this is where you're figuring out, well, hey, for this fee, if there is an option fee, how many dates is that going to be good for? So you decide how many dates, and then it's important to understand all the details around this, because your option period is only going to be good for however many dates by 5 p.m. that date. So that detail is super important. You want to know if you're going into things exactly when that option is up, and make sure that what needs to happen happens prior to that, especially if there were a need to terminate. That's got to be done by that deadline. Otherwise, this option no longer applies. And this also shows what happens if earnest money and option money is not delivered in time. So be aware of that. Time is of the essence. Title policy, someone's going to supply it essentially. So either the seller or buyer. So you check the appropriate box or boxes. And then again, title company here, which it says escrow agent, it says title company. That's the title company name as well, just like before. So that's what you put there. And then exceptions. So what this says is the standard printed exception as to discrepancies, conflict, shortages in area or boundary lines, encroachments or protrusions or overlapping improvements. This relates to the survey. It's essentially survey coverage. It's a rider and add-on to the title policy. So either it will be amended or deleted from the policy, or will be amended to read shortages in area. So basically it's, you're either gonna have that rider on it or not. So if you want it on it, you'd select the second box. Will be amended to read shortages in area at the expense of who. So it's going to come at a little bit of an added expense, to say the very least. Someone's got to cover it if that's going to be on there. So that's what that is. So who's paying title policy? Is there going to be the survey coverage added to it? And if so, who is paying for the survey coverage? Makes sense. Simple enough, right? Survey. So survey is, so is there an existing survey or not? So if there is an existing survey, one could very well be applicable. And so, because that's going to say, hey, however many days after this contract, the seller's existing survey of the property, will be delivered essentially. So how many days do they have to deliver that existing survey to the buyer? And if it's not acceptable, who's going to pay for a new one? So if there's not an existing survey, on the other hand, you got box 2 or 3 that can be selected. So either the buyer shall obtain a new survey or the seller shall obtain a new survey. One could be at the buyer's expense, one could be at the seller's expense. So whose expense if there's not an existing survey? So makes sense, simple enough, right? Objections. This is if there's a specific use the buyer is intending to have, for the property. If there is any, reason during the closing process that's found within the title work that, it can't be used for that purpose, then this would apply. So for instance, residential use might be an activity on here. That's one example. There's probably a lot of other examples you could think of, but if residential use is important, that's something that can be inputted here, and then you can set amount of days after the buyer receives the title commitment, exception documents, etc., which this is all paperwork from the title company as they're doing their research, and they'll get that over when it's ready. But you can review that, and if there's anything on there, that's essentially going to prevent that desired use, you can actually object, and that protects the buyer at the end of the day. And so there's more to cover. Before I continue here, I want to say one thing for those of you who are real estate agents out there. It's a curious thought to me that you're having to go to YouTube to kind of figure this stuff out. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad to help. I'm glad to, that this is informative, if nothing else, educational, entertaining, to say the least. But being as important of a situation as it is to have the correct guidance and help getting these forms completed, if you don't have that in your current situation, it kind of just makes me wonder, what else might you be missing out on that, could be a game changer for you in your business? Do you have mentorship? Because I didn't have that when I got started, but in my current situation in business, I work with a lot of people newer to the industry all across the map, and I have a process where they get paired up with a local mentor, and part of what that local mentor does is help them hands-on through these situations, reviewing these documents, making sure it's all done the correct way, having another set of eyes on things as you're taking these steps, getting your first few clients taken care of, if that's where you're at. So if you don't have that, and if that's something that might be beneficial or helpful for you, I welcome you to connect with me. You'll see a link in the description, schedule a call if you would like to connect further. But back to this. So we've got a lot of contract language here. It's important. I would get familiar with this like the back of your hands. But title notices, there's not really much for you to fill in as far as blanks here, except, hey, is the property in an owner's association? So it is or is not. So check the appropriate box. And by the way, I didn't already say this, but you'll see on these forms, there is a portion for the property address at the top, and at the bottom there are initials. So always have the property address. Depending on the platform you're using to complete this, it will probably auto-populate the property address based on what you initially inputted at the very top. But everyone's gonna have to sign as far as initials, and then signatures will be towards the end here. But again, more definitions and terms and stuff to know about here and read through. And then required notices. If there's anything required, for example, municipal utility district, so MUD, WCID or PID. So if any of those are applicable to this current property, which you can look up these terms to see what they mean if needed, that's where you'll input a note on that there as far as required notices. And then property condition. So seller's disclosure. Up to the point of signing of the contract, either the buyer has received it or not. So you'll the appropriate box should be checked regarding that. And if buyer has not received notice, how many days does the seller have to deliver it? Provided it's required, which in the event that it's not, box 3 would apply. But to be clear, the Texas Property Code specifies in what circumstances it's not required. Vast majority of circumstances it is required. There's a few exceptions, so be familiar with what those are, because you don't want to just select box 3 if it is required. I mean, if it's required, it's got to be delivered. Buyer accepts property as is, or if not, so one of these two boxes, either accepting it as is or not. And if not, they've got to spell out exactly what at the seller's expense needs to be completed. So it's either as is or, hey seller, we need you to do this in order to accept it. And that's being spelled out up front, which, by the way, going back to the option period, if there is an option period, that's kind of leverage in terms of the buyer has leverage to actually just walk away from the contract. So part of the idea there is like, hey, does the seller want to work if there's new information that turns out on the inspection period? So you might not know, like there might be something that comes up during an inspection that no one would have known about, that you wouldn't really have spelled out here, but maybe later there's a amendment that's worked out through the inspection period. And part of why the seller might want to work with the buyer is the buyer could just walk away if there's not agreement based on the new information. So kind of a side note there on that, some ways to think about it. In the residential service contracts, this is if the seller's going to provide a home warranty credit. And so if so, what is the amount of that credit going to be? The title company can help with ordering that later. They just need to know how much is going to be credited, because that's going to be accounted for on, the finalizing of the numbers, at the closing table. And then brokers and sales agents, we have a required disclosure if you're a broker, licensed agent in the business. And this kind of specifies exactly what would what the requirement would be. Like even if you're a 10% shareholder in a business entity in which the broker sales agents own, like that could apply too, even if you're just like an owner. But yeah, needless to say, if you're licensed, you got to disclose it here if you're a party of the contract. So if you're a buyer or seller and you hold that real estate license, that's where you got to disclose that. So either party, if it's applicable, they disclose that there. The closing date, on or before what date? So what's the target closing date? It's okay if you close sooner than the closing date, but the closing date's more of a deadline than anything else. So make sure that accounts for any time that the lender needs to actually close on it, especially depending on who the lender is and the loan type. They probably want to see a certain amount of days on there. So it's a good question for the lender if there's a lender involved. Buyer possession. So when is the buyer going to be able to take possession? You can do either upon closing and funding or according to a temporary residential lease. So closing and funding, probably most common residential lease. That's if either party is going to occupy the property before or after closing. Such as if the seller were staying after closing, that would be one example. But there's a form for that, and it's got to be notated here. And special provisions. This is something licensed agents should be careful about, because we are not allowed to practice law with our real estate license. So we don't want to get in a mode where we're writing contract language into something like this. That's where a lot of people can get into really big trouble. I know with my brokerage, like we literally need the broker's permission to put anything there whatsoever. And I think that's the best practice to have in place. So I'm going to kind of relay that idea and say, hey, if you're an agent looking to potentially add something there, go and consult your broker before you put anything there and get their input on what the exact language should be, if anything. But otherwise, the buyers or sellers can specify what they want to have happen there if it's not already otherwise covered elsewhere. And I mean, kind of the best practice above all else is, consult an attorney regarding that, at the end of the day, if it's going to get used. So settlement and other expenses. So this blank is for, hey, if the seller is going to contribute anything to the closing cost towards the buyer specifically, that's what this amount would be. So if it's a dollar amount that that the buyer wants covered from the seller and their closing costs, that's what would go there. And that's beyond, the other stuff we already covered up to this point in the contract, such as like survey, title, like title policy, stuff like that. So this is just for the rest of the closing costs, credit for it. And we will keep going here. And one thing I'll add for those of you who are agents out there, it can be crazy learning these contracts if you're early on in the business. I mean, and actually I'm going to cover too, by the way, the most common addenda that get added. So there's the third party financing addendum and the HOA addendum. I'll cover those because you'll see those very regularly. And there's a ton of other addendas that will come up from time to time. But who do you have in your corner? I already mentioned mentor, but like, you know, I myself know what it's like to be part of both a large and a small brokerage. Sometimes with smaller brokerages, you get more help from the broker. What's ironic is like large brokerages, sometimes even though they have a lot of agents, sometimes the broker's not the most accessible depending on the structure behind it. Fast forward to today though, I have access to a full-time team of managing brokers, literally 14 managing brokers on staff, and I can get their help and support within 2 or 3 minutes, 7 days a week from 7 to 7. So literally, what's that, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. I can get real-time broker help and support literally within 2 or 3 minutes of popping in to get help. It's the craziest thing. I didn't have that when I started in the business. And one of the most important things that brokers do is they help with contracts. They help with, I mean, not just how to fill them out, but like if you have any terms or anything at all, like you're able to get that in real time. It's a world of difference having that versus not having been there in situations where I didn't have that. On top of that, a great team of brokers, they're gonna do a lot to help fast track success. You know, like my broker team puts on a fast track to 6 figures class every week. It's a weekly business planning. Like they want to help our agents accelerate their careers in business. So if you're out there and you're like, you don't even have help with getting contracts filled out and you would like to see perhaps what else is out there to really help you not just have the basic help you need, but to take your business and life to the next level, you should really book a call with me. Pull up the description, go click the link, put a time to talk on the calendar. I'm happy to connect more if you're committed and serious to putting your best foot forward and really, you know, being all you can be and then some on your real estate journey. But back to the contract here, we got notices. So as you can see here, again, like it's kind of crazy, but there's like a page and a half where there's literally no blanks to fill in. And then notices to buyer and to seller. So this is for the title company more so than anything else. They want to know how to get in touch with the buyer. That's why this is on here. So it's good to have contact info for the buyer. That way the title company can copy them on it. And then this is for the buyer's agent, seller's agent too. Again, this is all for the title company here. If you don't fill this out, they're kind of going to be guessing as far as how to actually contact everyone. So good idea to get that completed. And then any addenda or anything attached, including the contract. So anything selected here is a part of the contract. So you got a lot of boxes. You got third-party financing addendum. You got amendment for property in a property owners association. So these two are very commonly selected if it's applicable. And then you got a bunch of other ones that might be applicable depending on the situation. And then you'll have a corresponding form with that in that case. Then you got, if there's any attorneys involved representing the buyer or seller, that's where this info would go. They can have one if they want one. And then executed date is the final acceptance. So whoever is the broker on the side that the final parties are signing. So for instance, if the buyer's already signed and they're sending it to the sellers to sign, after the seller sign, the seller's agent will execute the contract. It could be vice versa in a counteroffer. Sellers sign, they need buyer sign, then buyer's agent executes. Once all parties have signed, that's when this gets filled in. This should not be filled in prior to all parties signing, because that's when it's done. That's the executed date. Not before, not after. It's the date it's executed. Very important, because that will correspond with some of the other dates in the contract. Then buyer sign, seller sign, and there's a couple additional pages here. I mean, if you're a sharp real estate professional, I highly recommend making sure this is all completed correctly, just to make everyone's life easier. It's a good look if you're the buyer's agent and can get this done correctly for the listing agent and, you know, make their day a little bit easier. And so you've got other broker firm and listing firm. So other broker firm is not the listing firm. So if the buyer's agent is with another firm, that would be the other firm in this situation. And then it's saying, hey, buyer only represents the buyer's agent or what? So if the buyer's representing the buyer's agent, you would check that box. And then if there's another broker with the seller, you would select the appropriate box. But if they're representing the seller solely, boom. Let me explain the rest of this. So let's say the buyer's agent and seller's agent are with the same brokerage. In that case, this box will be selected, seller and buyer as an intermediary, because the brokerage is an intermediary in that situation. And then instead of the buyer's agent's info being here, it will actually go here, crazy enough. So instead of other broker firm, it would be seller associate's name. Hopefully that makes sense. So you're gonna be all on the right side if everyone's with the same firm. Two different firms, you use the top portion of the right side and then the left side. So all the way up to city, state, zip, and then make sure you have the correct information. There may or may not be a team. If there's not a team, that would be blank. Listing associate, their license, broker, brokerage name, the brokerage license number, etc., etc. I think the rest is self-explanatory. This is saying, hey, what is the listing broker agreeing to pay the other broker in the way of a fee? So if there's a listing brokerage and an other brokerage, what is on the MLS? Or in the future, it might not even be what's on the MLS, but you should get that info ahead of time. So what are they agreeing to pay? That's where you would put that compensation amount in here. And as it says here, this disclosure is for informational purposes and does not change the previous agreement between brokers to pay or share a commission. So some people might think, especially if they're newer to the business, that you could put a different number on there that is like higher than what's on the MLS and negotiate commission that way. That's not how this works. Just like it says on here, this is only for information. This is really just to convey the information to the title. So if you put a number on here that was not truly what is being offered, that won't actually work to get a higher commission. So just FYI on that. Best way to make sure you get your full commission if you're an agent would be to actually have the correct conversation with your buyers up front, crazy enough. And account for situations where if the full commission you work for is not being offered by the other side of the transaction on a listing. And then all of this, these are receipts. So option fee receipt, earnest money receipt, contract receipt, etc. Title company will fill these out upon receipt, especially if you follow up on it. And that is the TREC contract. But like I said, let's do this. I want to show what the most common addenda would be. So third-party financing, something you're going to see most transactions, and then also HOAs. A lot of properties have them, especially ones that aren't, from 40 years ago. So third-party financing here. So what you're going to do, obviously you got to put the property address, so street address and city, and then you're going to also want to select the appropriate box. So what type of third-party financing? So A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So one of those is going to be selected. Commonly conventional, if it's a VA buyer, instead you'll select the VA. So one of these should be selected, and then you'll fill in the appropriate information. Easiest way to get this information is just ask the loan officer. Give them a call, walk through this with them, just make sure you got the correct info. Sometimes they'll put it on the pre-approval letter. But first mortgage, that would be the loan amount. That's not the purchase price, that's the loan amount. So whatever portion is being financed, so if it's 80% of the purchase price, you'll put whatever the dollar amount is of that 80%. Due in full, that's however many years are being financed. If it's a 30-year loan, that would be 30 years with interest not to exceed what? What's the interest rate? Not to exceed this rate. So if it's 7%, 7.5%, you want to put the exact number on there. You don't want to put lower because it's not to exceed that amount. And then per annum for the first, if it's a 30-year loan, 30 years. And then origination cost, again, that's a lender question. I would ask them what the number would be for that. If it's 1%, if it's more than 1%, whatever it is. And then this won't be used unless there's a second mortgage in the situation involved. So again, that would be something that should be known based on the loan type. But a lot of times it's going to be this box, that box, if it's conventional financing, and then making sure these 5 blanks are filled in correctly here. And then same kind of course of action with the other loans here. FHA is very similar. VA, it's probably going to match the purchase price if it's 100% financed. And then it's also important to note with a VA loan specifically, you have something additional down here, right? So VA, and actually this is for FHA and VA. So if it's one of those two loan types, you've got to fill this in as well. And it's going to, you want to match the amount of the, property value essentially with that. So make sure that this is filled in correctly according to the loan type, because this is protection for the buyer in the event that the property does not appraise for the purchase amount, because in that case they're going to have an issue with the loan. So make sure that this is filled in if it's an FHA or a VA buyer. Otherwise, if it's conventional, you don't need that part. And then approval of financing, if you want to have buyer approval period in there, you'll put a certain amount of days. And just read what this says. It's essentially a contingency in the contract around financing of the buyer actually qualifying for the loan they're setting out to get. If you don't have that, then the contract's not contingent upon that. But you have a set amount of days, whatever is agreed upon by the buyer and seller for that. And that is the third-party financing in a nutshell. You got signatures for everyone here. And let's go to the HOA addendum. We'll cover that real quick and we'll wrap up here. So with the HOA or Property Owners Association addendum, it's pretty simple and straightforward. A lot of these addendums are, especially once you're familiar with them. What will happen though is you're gonna start with the address at the top. So property address is gonna go in the very top, as you will see here. So street address and city should match what's on the contract. And then you've got basically three things it's saying, hey, name of the association, if there's a bigger management company involved, and then phone number. So, if it's like neighborhood name, HOA, you'd put that. If there's like a bigger management association, that's why it says association. In the parentheses, you'll put the bigger company name that runs it, and then the phone number, point of contact for the HOA. That's what those three data points are. And then one of these boxes, select the appropriate box according to what both parties want to have happen. I'm not going to read all this, but as you can see, some of it, it pertains more to the seller than buyer. Who's going to deliver the docs, pay for it if there's a fee associated with the delivery of the HOA docs, which that's part of how these HOA companies actually bring revenue in. So typically someone's going to have to pay for something, so this addresses who's going to cover that. Or if the buyer's already received the info, there's an option there. Some check boxes, make sure you account for what needs to be selected given the situation. And then if there's any deposits, fees, reserves, or anything of that nature related to the transfer. And by the way, this is different from the delivery of the documents. Like sometimes they charge a transfer fee to actually transfer the ownership within the HOA. And then usually there's a different fee for the delivery of the subdivision information resale certificates. So to be clear, we're talking two different things here, but this would kind of cap out what the buyer would pay for any transfer fees. And you should be able to figure out what the HOA transfer fee is going into the transaction. You can verify that with an association if need be. And then seller authorizes association to release, there's a notice there, buyer or seller, if there's a additional cost of obtaining the information, who's going to cover it. So you're just figuring out who's paying the fees related to the HOA docs and the transfer of it. So sign there. And like I said, there's a lot more addenda. I'm not going to cover it all here because it doesn't really pertain to every single scenario, but you do enough transactions, you're going to see different addenda pop up from time to time. So that's why it's so important to you to know exactly what the contract says. But the more familiar you are with the actual purchase contract, I would read through it 2-3 times, get familiar with all the paragraphs. That being said, that's the 1 to 4 family residential contract for resale purposes. Promulgated in the state of Texas. And let me leave you with this. If you got value out of this video, all I'd ask is that you hit subscribe so I can share more tips and resources with you in the time ahead. And if you're someone in the business, open to learning more about how you can get more hands-on help with contracts, can get all done correctly, mentorship, learning from top producers, how to actually fast track your success, with business planning and all that good stuff. If you'd be open to learning more about what that could all look like, and how we could potentially help you take your business to the next level if you're stuck in a situation where you don't even have help with your contracts in a major way, go ahead and schedule a call with me. Seriously, book a call. If you're committed to this, I'll commit to taking a few minutes at the very least to connect with you to see what we can bring to the table to help you take things to the next level. So that being said, thank you for watching the video, and until next time, I look forward to seeing you on the next video.